After my wife died, her children said, "We want the estate, the business, everything." My lawyer urged me to fight, but I refused. Everyone thought I had lost my mind. At the final hearing, I signed the papers. They smiled until their lawyer turned pale when he read just one sentence. But before I tell you what that sentence was, let me introduce myself. My name is Harrison Blackwood. I am 70 years old. I have grease permanently stained into the lines of my palms and a spine that aches when it rains, reminders of 40 years spent building Blackwood logistics from a single rusted truck into a $40 million empire. I thought I had seen the worst of human nature in the cutthroat world of transport, but I was wrong. The worst kind of cruelty does not come from competitors. It comes from the people you fed, clothed, and raised. If you are watching this, take a second to subscribe to the channel. It helps me share this story with more people who might be going through the same hell. Let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Now let me take you back to the day my world officially ended. It was a Tuesday. The kind of humid, suffocating Tuesday that makes a wool suit feel like a prison. We were at the cemetery. The priest was droning on about ashes to ashes, but I could barely hear him. My eyes were locked on the mahogany casket being slowly lowered into the Georgia clay. Elizabeth, my Beth. The only woman who ever looked at my dirty mechanic hands and saw a future. We had been married for 30 years. She was the softness to my rough edges. And now she was gone. I stood there clutching a single white rose so hard the thorns pierced my skin. The physical pain was grounding. It was the only thing keeping me from falling into the open grave with her. I wanted silence. I wanted a moment of reverence. Just one moment to say goodbye to the love of my life. But silence is expensive, and apparently my stepchildren could not afford it. Standing right behind me were Preston and Tiffany, Elizabeth's children from her first marriage. I had taken them in when Preston was 8 and Tiffany was 5. I had paid for their private schools, their cars, Preston's MBA, and Tiffany's endless failed startups. I thought that over 3 decades I had earned the title of father. I was wrong. Over the sound of the wind rustling the oak trees, I heard a whisper. It was sharp, agitated. It was Preston. "Sell the logistics stock now," he hissed. I could hear the tap, tap, tap of his thumb on a smartphone screen. "Do not wait for the market to close. The old man is unstable. The stock will dip when the news of Mom spreads. Dump it." My blood ran cold. He was standing 3 feet from his mother's grave, and he was shorting my company's stock. He was betting against the very business that had paid for the Italian suit he was wearing. I tried to tune him out. I looked at Tiffany, hoping for some shared grief. She was standing to my left wearing a black dress that cost more than my first truck. She was not looking at the coffin. She was looking at her reflection in the screen of her phone, adjusting her oversized sunglasses. "It is so hot out here," she muttered loud enough for me to hear. "My foundation is literally melting off. Why did he have to pick a cemetery so far from the city? This is ridiculous." She sighed a long, dramatic exhale of boredom. She checked her watch. I felt a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with the heat. These were the children Elizabeth had adored. She had spent her final weeks worrying about them, making me promise to take care of them. "Harrison, be patient with them," she had whispered in the hospital. "They handle grief differently." Is this grief, I wondered? Trading stocks and worrying about makeup. The priest finished his prayer. He threw the first handful of dirt onto the casket. The sound was like a thunderclap in my heart. Thud. It was final. She was really gone. I stepped forward, my knees shaking to place my white rose on the wood. My hand trembled as I let it go. "Goodbye, my love," I whispered, my voice cracking. "I will keep my promise." I stood there for a long time, head bowed, waiting for the others to pay their respects. I expected Preston to come up, maybe put a hand on my shoulder, share a memory. I expected Tiffany to finally break down. Instead, I felt a heavy hand clap onto my shoulder. It was not a comfort. It was a grip, firm, possessive. I turned around. Preston was looming over me. He is a tall man, soft in the middle, with eyes that calculate value rather than see people. He was not crying. His eyes were dry and clear. "We need to talk, Harrison," he said. His voice was devoid of any emotion. It was his boardroom voice. "Not now, Preston," I said, my voice raspy. "We are at your mother's funeral. We are calling a family meeting for 6 p.m. tonight at the main house." He continued, ignoring me completely. "We need to go over the legal matters, the estate, the transition of assets." I stared at him. The dirt on his mother's grave wasn't even settled yet. "Preston," I said, trying to keep the rage from boiling over. "Can't this wait until tomorrow or next week?" Tiffany stepped up beside him. She had put her phone away, but her arms were crossed. "We can't wait," she said, her voice sharp. "Mom didn't leave a will, Harrison. You know what the state laws are. We need to clarify our position before the banks get involved. We don't want things to get messy." Messy, I looked from her to Preston. They stood like a united front, a wall of entitlement. There was no pity in their eyes, no sadness, just hunger. I realized then, standing on that manicured grass, that I was completely alone. The woman who protected me from their greed was 6 feet under. The buffer was gone. I looked at Preston's hand still gripping my shoulder. It felt like a police officer arresting a criminal, not a son comforting a father. "Fine," I said. 6 p.m. Preston nodded, satisfied. He removed his hand and wiped it on his pants as if touching my cheap suit had soiled him. "Don't be late," he said, "and bring the keys to the safe." They turned and walked away toward their black limousine, leaving me standing there in the sun. They didn't look back at their mother's grave once. Not once. I watched them go, and for the first time in 30 years, the love I had for them evaporated. It didn't fade. It didn't wither. It just vanished, replaced by a cold, hard knot in my stomach. Elizabeth had asked me to take care of them. But as I watched their car pull away, I realized that taking care of them might mean something very different than what she intended. I wiped a single tear from my cheek. It would be the last tear I shed for them. I walked back to my old pickup truck, the one Preston hated because it lowered the property value of the driveway. I sat inside, the leather cracked and hot against my back. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. They wanted a meeting. They wanted to talk about assets and transitions. "Fine," I whispered to the empty cab. I started the engine. The old diesel roared to life, a sound I understood better than the whispers of my family. "You want a war, kids," I said, shifting into gear. "You just declared one on the wrong man." I drove out of the cemetery, leaving my wife behind, and headed toward a battle I never wanted, but one I was absolutely going to finish. Because they forgot one thing. I didn't just inherit this empire. I built it. And I knew where every single body was buried. I parked my truck next to Preston's limousine, the rusted metal of my fender almost touching the polished black paint of his rented luxury. The house loomed in front of me, a sprawling colonial estate that Elizabeth and I had bought 20 years ago. It was supposed to be our sanctuary, a place where we would grow old together, watching the sunsets from the porch. Now with her gone, it looked different. It looked like a fortress that had been breached. I walked up the stone steps, my heavy boots thudding against the granite. The front door was unlocked. I pushed it open, and the cool air conditioning hit me, carrying with it a scent that made my stomach turn. It was not the smell of flowers from the funeral. It was the smell of celebration. Laughter drifted from the main salon. It was a loud, raucous sound that had no business being in a house of mourning. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and walked toward the archway. The scene before me made my blood run hot in my veins. Greg, my son-in-law, was standing by the mahogany bar. He had his suit jacket off, his sleeves rolled up, and he was holding a corkscrew. In his other hand was a dusty, dark green bottle. My heart stopped. That was not just any bottle of wine. It was a 1974 Cabernet Sauvignon from the Napa Valley vineyard, where Elizabeth and I had spent our honeymoon. We had bought it with the last of our savings back then, promising each other we would open it only on our 50th wedding anniversary. It had survived 4 moves, 2 recessions, and 30 years of temptation. It was a symbol of our endurance. Greg jammed the corkscrew into the aged cork with the grace of a plumber fixing a clogged drain. "Hey, Harrison," Greg called out, his face flushed with early intoxication. "We needed something to wash down the dry sandwiches from the reception. Hope you don't mind. This stuff was just gathering dust anyway." Before I could move, before I could even form a word of protest, he pulled. The cork gave way with a soft pop that sounded to me like a bone breaking. He tilted the bottle, pouring the deep ruby liquid into a plastic cup. A plastic cup. He took a swig, swished it around his mouth, and made a face. "Kind of sour," he grunted. "Probably turned vinegar years ago." He poured the rest of the glass into the potted fern next to him. I felt a scream rising in my throat, a primal roar of rage, but it died there when I saw what was happening on the other side of the room. Tiffany was moving along the walls with a pad of neon yellow sticky notes in her hand. She looked like a predator stalking prey. She stopped in front of the oil painting that hung above the fireplace. It was a landscape of the Scottish Highlands, a piece Elizabeth had loved, because it reminded her of her grandfather. I remembered saving for 6 months to buy that for her birthday. Tiffany slapped a yellow note onto the canvas. On it, written in sharp black marker, was the word, "Sold." She moved to the next one. The antique clock on the mantelpiece. Slap. Sold. The porcelain vase from the Ming Dynasty replica collection. Slap. Sold. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice trembling, not with fear, but with the effort to keep from strangling her. Tiffany turned, not even looking guilty. She looked annoyed that I had interrupted her workflow. "Oh, good you are back," she said, peeling off another sticker. "I am just cataloging the inventory. I have an appraiser coming tomorrow morning at 8. We need to clear this clutter out fast if we want to list the house by next month. The market is hot right now, and I need the liquidity for my new brand launch." List the house. I stepped further into the room, my hands balling into fists at my sides. "This is my house, Tiffany. I live here. My name is on the mortgage." Actually, it is not. The voice came from the leather armchair in the corner. Preston was sitting there, his legs crossed, looking at a file folder. He didn't stand up. He didn't offer me a seat. He looked at me over the rim of his glasses, with the cold, detached expression of a coroner examining a corpse. "I checked the deed this morning," Harrison Preston said, flipping a page. "The house was in Mom's name. Solely. She bought it with the inheritance from her aunt, remember? You just paid for the renovations." He closed the folder and stood up, smoothing out his suit. He walked toward me, stopping just outside of striking distance. He knew I was a mechanic. He knew I still had the strength of a man who lifted engine blocks, but he also knew I was outnumbered and outmaneuvered. "Here is the reality," Harrison Preston said, his voice smooth and venomous. "Mom didn't leave a will. We checked her safe, her lawyer's office, everything. She died intestate." He let the legal term hang in the air like a guillotine blade. "Do you know what that means in the state of Georgia?" he asked, tilting his head. "It means the estate is divided among her biological children and her spouse. But since the house and the majority of the liquid assets were premarital or solely in her name, and since you signed that prenup 30 years ago to prove you weren't after her money, well," he smirked, a small, tight curling of his lip, "you effectively own about 10% of this estate, Harrison. And as the majority shareholders of the inheritance, Tiffany and I have decided to liquidate." He gestured around the room, encompassing the wine Greg was wasting and the art Tiffany was tagging. "We are calling in a forensic accountant to audit the family accounts," Preston continued. Until then, you are technically a guest in this house, a guest who is overstaying his welcome. I looked at them. The three of them. Greg, the failure who needed my wine to feel rich. Tiffany, the narcissist who needed my money to feel important. And Preston, the sociopath who needed my power to feel like a man. I wanted to throw them out. I wanted to grab Preston by his expensive lapels and drag him out the front door. I wanted to smash the wine bottle over Greg's head. But I looked at Preston's phone. He was recording. He was holding it casually by his side, but the camera lens was pointed right at me. They were baiting me. They wanted the angry, violent truck driver to make a scene. They wanted me to throw a punch so they could call the police, get a restraining order, and kick me out tonight instead of next month. I took a breath. It was the hardest breath I have ever taken. It tasted like ash and betrayal. I looked at the wine soaking into the dirt of the fern. I looked at the yellow sticker on the painting of the Highlands. "You are right, Preston," I said, my voice dropping to a low, rough rumble. "I am just a guest." Preston blinked, surprised by my surrender. He lowered the phone slightly. "Glad you are being reasonable," he said. "I am tired," I said, turning away from them so they wouldn't see the fire burning in my eyes. "I am going to the guest house. I will stay there until we sort this out." "That is for the best," Tiffany chimed in, slapping a sticker on the grand piano. "And Harrison, don't take anything from the main house. We have an inventory list." I didn't answer. I walked out of the room, past the open bottle of wine, past the defiled memories of my marriage. I walked out the back door and across the lawn to the small guest cottage at the edge of the property. As I closed the door of the cottage behind me, the silence returned. But this time it wasn't the silence of grief. It was the silence of a hunter waiting in the blind. They thought they had won because they knew the law. They thought they had cornered an old man who didn't understand the complexities of probate and estate planning. I sat down on the small, lumpy bed in the guest house. I didn't turn on the light. I sat in the dark listening to the crickets, and I let the anger settle into something cold and hard. They had the deed. They had the wine. They had the art. But they had forgotten one thing. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a set of keys. Not the keys to the house, not the keys to the safe. These were old brass keys worn smooth by decades of use. The keys to the maintenance tunnels under the logistics facility. The keys to the archive room that wasn't on the official blueprints. Preston said the house was in Elizabeth's name. He was right. But he hadn't asked about the land the logistics company stood on. He hadn't asked about the intellectual property rights to the shipping software I had coded myself in the 80s. They wanted to play by the letter of the law, fine. I would give them a lesson in law they would never forget. I lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. I could see the lights of the main house blazing through the window. They were celebrating their victory. Let them drink. Let them tag the furniture. Tomorrow the mourning period ended. Tomorrow the war began, and I knew exactly where to strike first. I closed my eyes, and for the first time that day I smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile of a wolf who just realized the sheep left the gate open. The next morning, the air conditioning in the Blackwood Logistics Tower felt colder than usual. I walked through the glass doors of the building I had constructed brick by brick 20 years ago. Usually the receptionist, a kind woman named Martha, would greet me with a warm smile and a fresh pot of black coffee. Today, she did not look up. She kept her eyes glued to her computer screen, her fingers typing frantically, as if making eye contact with me would cost her her job. I walked past the cubicles. The hum of conversation died down as I passed. Heads bowed. Phones were lifted to ears to fake important calls. I was a ghost haunting my own castle. I took the elevator to the top floor, the silence of the ride pressing against my eardrums like deep water. When the doors opened, I saw them. They were already in the boardroom. The heavy oak doors were open, and the long table was filled with faces I had known for decades. There was Bob, the operations manager I had hired when he was just a kid out of the army. There was Susan, the head of HR, who had helped me set up the driver pension fund. And at the head of the table, sitting in the high-backed leather chair that had molded to the shape of my spine over thousands of hours, was Preston. He looked comfortable, too comfortable. He was wearing a navy blue suit that probably cost more than my first rig. He was speaking in a low, confident baritone, and as I stepped into the room, he stopped. "Ah, Harrison," Preston said, standing up. He did not say Dad. He did not say Mr. Chairman. Just Harrison. "You are just in time. Please take a seat." He gestured to a small empty chair on the side of the room. Not at the table. To the side. Like I was a consultant. Or a defendant. I ignored the chair. I walked to the end of the table opposite him and remained standing. My hands gripped the back of an empty seat, the leather cool under my calloused palms. "What is this meeting, Preston?" I asked, my voice echoing slightly in the quiet room. "The board meets on the first Monday of the month. Today is Wednesday." Preston sighed, a sound of heavy burden. He picked up a remote control and pointed it at the wall behind me. A projector hummed to life. A graph appeared on the screen. It was a jagged red line plunging downward like a falling stone. "We are facing a crisis," Harrison Preston said, addressing the room, not me. He walked around the table, commanding the space. "Blackwood Logistics has been the leader in interstate transport for 40 years. But the industry is changing. Automation, AI logistics, green energy mandates, and frankly, our leadership has not kept pace." He clicked a button. Another slide. This one showed my face next to a series of words. Traditional. Risk-averse. Slow. I stared at the screen. The numbers were wrong. I knew the quarterly reports by heart. We were up 6% last quarter. We had just secured the Walmart contract renewal. "Those numbers are fabricated," I said, my voice low. "We are profitable. We have zero debt." Preston stopped pacing. He looked at me with a pity that made my skin crawl. "Profit is not growth, Harrison," he said softly. "And in this market, if you are not growing, you are dying. Your refusal to leverage our assets for high-yield investments has cost the shareholders millions in potential revenue. You are running this company like it is 1985. He turned to the board members. I looked at Bob. Bob looked down at his notepad, his face flushing red. I looked at Susan. She was twisting a pen in her fingers, refusing to meet my gaze. They had been bought. Or threatened. Or both. "But that is not the only issue," Preston continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that forced everyone to lean in. "We are a family company, and we protect our own. Which is why this is so hard for me to say." He clicked the remote again. The screen went black. The theatrics were sickening. "Since Mom passed, we have all noticed the changes," Preston said. He looked at me now, his eyes wide with fake concern. The forgetfulness, the outbursts of anger, the confusion about simple financial matters. Yesterday you tried to pay for flowers with a personal card that had been flagged for suspicious activity because you forgot the PIN code 3 times. I felt the blood rushing to my face. That was a lie. He had frozen the account. "Preston, stop this," I warned. "It is nothing to be ashamed of, Harrison," he interrupted, his voice soothing. "Early onset dementia is a tragedy, but it is a reality we have to face. The stress of losing Mom has clearly accelerated the decline. You are not fit to captain this ship anymore. You are steering us into an iceberg because you can no longer see the horizon." The room was silent. I could hear the hum of the projector fan. Dementia. He was using the D word. He was weaponizing my grief and my age to paint me as a senile old man who needed to be put out to pasture. He slid a thick document across the polished oak table toward me. It stopped inches from my hand. "This is a retirement package," Harrison Preston said. "It is generous, extremely generous. You keep your salary for 2 years. You get full medical coverage which you will need for the assisted living facility we have selected in Florida. It is near the beach. You will like it." I looked at the document. The cover read, "Voluntary resignation and transfer of voting rights." And if I don't sign, I asked, looking up at him. Preston's expression hardened. The mask of the concerned son slipped for just a fraction of a second. "Then we have a fiduciary duty to the shareholders," he said coldly. "We will file a petition with the court for emergency guardianship. We have testimony from staff about your erratic behavior. We have the incident with the wine yesterday. We will drag this out in public court, Harrison. We will have you declared mentally incompetent. Your legacy will not be the man who built this company. It will be the crazy old man who had to be removed for his own safety." I stood there, and my hands began to shake. They shook not because I was weak. They shook not because I was scared. They shook because every fiber of my being wanted to reach across that table and throttle him. I wanted to scream that I could recite the VIN number of every truck in the fleet. I wanted to roar that I had built this table while he was still in diapers. But to the room, to the silent board members watching me, the shaking looked like fear. It looked like weakness. It looked like Parkinson's. I saw Bob exchange a glance with Susan. They saw a trembling old man who was losing his grip. Preston had staged this perfectly. My anger was his evidence. I looked down at my hands, the hands that had changed tires in the snow, the hands that had signed the first payroll checks. Now they were betraying me. I took a deep breath. The air in the room tasted like ozone and treachery. If I fought him now right here, I would lose. If I yelled, I was crazy. If I attacked him, I was violent. He had checkmated me on the board. I needed time. I needed to get out of this room before I did something that would seal my fate. I reached out and took the document. My hand was still trembling. "I need to read this," I said, my voice raspy. "I need time to process." Preston smiled. It was the smile of a shark that just tasted blood in the water. "Take 24 hours, he said. "But the offer expires at noon tomorrow." After that, the lawyers filed the petition. I turned around, clutching the paperwork to my chest like a shield. I walked out of the boardroom. I did not look back. I could feel their eyes on my back burning holes in my jacket. I could hear the collective exhale of the room as the door clicked shut behind me. I made it to the elevator before my knees gave out. I leaned against the metal wall as the car descended, sliding down until I was crouching on the floor. I wasn't crying. I was hyperventilating. They thought I was finished. They thought the shaking was the end. But as the elevator hit the lobby floor, I stood up. I smoothed my jacket. I stopped shaking. Preston had made one mistake. He thought the shaking was fear. He didn't know it was the engine revving up. He wanted a war. He wanted to talk about assets and liabilities. I walked out of the building past the receptionist who still wouldn't look at me. I stepped into the blinding sunlight of the parking lot. I had 24 hours. That was not enough time to save the company, but it was plenty of time to burn it down. I walked out of the office building and into the parking lot, the heat of the asphalt radiating through the soles of my boots. My hands were no longer shaking, but my mind was racing at 1,000 miles an hour. Preston had given me 24 hours. 24 hours to sign away my life, or be dragged through a public court battle that would shatter my reputation. I needed to think. I needed to clear my head. I got into my truck and drove. I didn't drive home to the guest cottage where I was a prisoner, and I didn't dress to the bar. I drove to the one place where I could still find a shred of peace. The florist on 4th Street. Elizabeth loved white lilies. Every week for 30 years I had brought her a bouquet. Even now that she was gone, I couldn't break the routine. It was the only thing keeping me tethered to the man I used to be. I walked into the shop, the bell above the door chiming softly. The air was thick with the scent of roses and damp earth. Mrs. Gable, the owner, smiled when she saw me. She had arranged the flowers for my wedding, and 3 days ago she had arranged the flowers for my wife's funeral. "The usual, Mr. Blackwood?" she asked gently, her eyes full of sympathy. "Yes, please," I said, my voice sounding rough even to my own ears. 24 lilies. For the grave." She nodded and busied herself with the stems, wrapping them in the thick wax paper I knew so well. I reached into my wallet and pulled out my black titanium credit card. It was a card reserved for high-net-worth individuals, a symbol of the success I had scraped and clawed for. It had a limit higher than the value of Mrs. Gable's entire shop. She rang up the total, $50 and change, a trivial amount. I tapped the card against the reader. Beep, a red light flashed. Declined. Mrs. Gable frowned. "That is strange," she said. "Let me try it again. Maybe the chip is dirty." She inserted the card into the machine this time. I waited, staring at the lilies. Beep. Declined. "Please contact issuer." My stomach dropped. I felt a cold sweat prickle on the back of my neck. "Try this one," I said, pulling out my business expense card. Beep. Declined. I pulled out my personal debit card. Beep. Declined. The silence in the flower shop was deafening. I could feel Mrs. Gable looking at me not with suspicion, but with a terrible, crushing pity. She thought I was broke. She thought the old widower had lost everything. "It is okay, Mr. Blackwood," she whispered, pushing the flowers toward me. "Take them. You can pay me later. I know how hard it is right now." Her kindness hurt more than Preston's cruelty. I was Harrison Blackwood. I did not take charity. I left the flowers on the counter. "Keep them," I said, my voice tight. "I will be back." I walked out of the shop, the humiliation burning my face like a sunburn. I got into my truck and slammed the door. My hands were trembling again as I dialed the number for the bank. Jerry answered on the second ring. He was my personal banker, a man I had taken golfing, a man whose son I had written a recommendation letter for. "Jerry," I said, cutting off his greeting. "My cards are declined, all of them." "What is going on?" There was a pause, a long, heavy silence. "Harrison," Jerry said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I was about to call you. We received a court order an hour ago." "A court order," I shouted. "From who?" "From Preston's lawyers," Jerry said. "It is a temporary freezing order. They filed an emergency motion claiming you are mentally incapacitated and that there is a risk of asset dissipation." They cited the incident with the wine and some erratic behavior at the board meeting. The judge granted a 72-hour hold until the hearing. I gripped the phone so hard I thought the screen would crack. "Jerry, you know me," I growled. "You know I am not crazy. Unfreeze my accounts. Now." "I can't, Harrison," he pleaded. "It is a court order. If I touch those accounts, I go to jail." "I am sorry. You have zero access, not even to the joint checking." I hung up. I didn't say goodbye. I stared at the phone. Zero access. I had $40 million in assets and I couldn't buy a bouquet of flowers for my dead wife. Preston wasn't just coming for the company. He was systematically dismantling my existence. He wanted me powerless, penniless, and desperate. I started the engine. The roar of the diesel was the only thing that made sense. I wasn't going to hide in the guest house. I was going back to the tower. I was going to look Preston in the eye and tell him exactly what I thought of his court order. I drove back to Blackwood Logistics, ignoring the speed limits. I pulled into my reserved parking spot, the one painted with my initials. I marched toward the glass doors, my boots striking the pavement with the rhythm of a war drum. I walked into the lobby. It was busy. Couriers running packages, executives talking on phones. I headed straight for the private elevator that led to the executive suite. I pulled out my security badge, the one I had carried for 20 years. I held it up to the scanner. Buzz! A red light flashed. Access denied. I tried it again. Buzz! Access denied. I looked at the receptionist's desk. Martha wasn't there. In her place was a young girl I didn't recognize typing on her phone. Open the elevator, I barked. She looked up, startled. I am sorry, sir. I am Harrison Blackwood. Open the damn elevator. She looked at her screen, confused. I don't see your name on the active visitor list, sir. Visitor list. I built this building, sir. Please lower your voice, a deep voice boomed from behind me. I turned around. Standing there was a security guard I had never seen before. He was huge, easily 6'4", with muscles bulging out of a uniform that looked too tight. He wasn't one of my guys. He was private security. Contract muscle. Where is Joe? I asked. Where is the head of security? Joe was relieved of duty this morning, the new guard said, stepping into my personal space. I am the new shift supervisor, and I have specific instructions regarding your access credentials. He pointed to the red light on the elevator panel. Your badge has been deactivated, Mr. Blackwood. You are no longer authorized to be on the premises without an escort from the current administration. Current administration. He talked about my son as if he were a new government regime. I am the chairman of the board, I said, stepping closer to him while looking up into his indifferent eyes. Get out of my way. I tried to step around him. He moved faster than a man his size should. He put a hand on my chest. It wasn't a shove, but it was a solid wall of force. Don't make this ugly, sir, he said. I have orders to escort you off the property if you cause a disturbance. Do not make me drag an old man out in front of his employees. I looked around. People had stopped walking. Employees I had known for years were watching from the mezzanine. They saw the founder of the company being blocked by a hired goon. They saw the humiliation. They saw the end of an era. If I fought him, I would lose. I would end up in handcuffs, and Preston would have the final piece of evidence he needed to prove I was violent and unstable. I took a step back. The guard dropped his hand, but he kept his eyes on me, ready to pounce. I smoothed my jacket. I adjusted my collar. I looked at the guard. Then I looked up at the camera in the corner of the ceiling. I knew Preston was watching. I knew he was up there in my office, laughing. You have orders, I said to the guard, my voice low and steady. Well, here is a warning. Enjoy the job while it lasts. Because when I come back through these doors, you will be the first one I fire. I turned on my heel and walked out. I didn't look at the employees. I didn't look at the receptionist. I walked out into the blinding sun, feeling lighter than I had in days. Preston thought he had trapped me. He thought that by taking my money and my access, he had taken my power. But he was wrong. He had just made me dangerous. A man with nothing to lose is the most terrifying thing on earth. And as I walked to my truck, I realized I had one key left. A key that didn't require a microchip. A key to a place Preston had forgotten existed. I wasn't going home. I was going to the archives. It was time to rewrite history. I drove my truck to the far side of the industrial park, parking behind a row of rusted shipping containers where the shadows were deep and unforgiving. It was 2 a.m. The logistics facility rose up against the night sky like a sleeping beast, silent and imposing. To Preston and his new security team, this building was just glass and steel, a fortress protected by key cards and digital codes. But they forgot that before the glass, there was brick, and before the digital locks, there was iron. I walked through the tall grass, the dew soaking the hem of my jeans, until I reached the old maintenance shed at the very rear of the property. It looked abandoned, covered in ivy, but I knew better. I pulled out a heavy iron key from my pocket. It was cold against my skin, a relic from 1982, when I was still greasing axles myself. This door led to the ventilation tunnels that ran beneath the main foundation, a failsafe I had built in case of fires or chemical spills. Preston didn't know about it because Preston never looked at the blueprints of the things he tried to sell. The lock was stiff. I had to use both hands, gritting my teeth as arthritis flared in my knuckles, but with a sharp metallic snap, the bolt gave way. The door creaked open, exhaling the stale scent of oil dust and damp concrete. It was the smell of my youth. I clicked on a small pen light, holding it between my teeth as I descended the narrow metal stairs. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic rhythm that echoed in the confined space. Thump, thump, thump. I wasn't a spy. I wasn't a criminal. I was a 70-year-old man breaking into his own legacy, terrified that a $20 an hour guard would catch me and drag me to jail. The tunnel was long and dark. Every creak of the pipes above made me freeze. I moved slowly, counting the steps. Left at the junction, straight for 50 yards, then up the service ladder. Climbing that ladder was the hardest physical thing I had done in years. My breath came in ragged gasps. My shoulders burned, but the anger fueled me. Every rung was a step toward the truth. I pushed open the hatch at the top, emerging into the janitorial closet on the executive floor. I stepped out into the hallway. It was eerily quiet. The plush carpet swallowed the sound of my boots. I kept the light off now, navigating by the ambient glow of the exit signs. I moved like a ghost toward the corner office. My office. Or at least it used to be. The door was unlocked. Arrogance. Preston was so sure of his power he didn't even lock his door at night. I slipped inside and closed it softly behind me. The room smelled different. The scent of my old pipe tobacco and leather was gone, replaced by something sterile and chemical like expensive cleaning fluid and cheap ambition. I swept the beam of my flashlight across the room. He had already changed the furniture. My mahogany desk, the one Elizabeth had bought me for our 10th anniversary, was gone. In its place was a sleek glass monstrosity that looked like it would shatter if you leaned on it too hard. I went to the desk. I needed to know what he was planning. I needed proof. I tried the computer, but it was password protected, and I wasn't a hacker. I opened the drawers. Locked. My heart began to sink. I had risked everything to come here, and I was going to leave empty-handed. The panic started to rise in my throat. I scanned the room, desperate. My beam hit the corner. The shredder. It was a large industrial-grade shredder, the kind that could chew through credit cards and staples. A small red light was blinking on the control panel. Jammed. I walked over to it. Preston was lazy. He had always been lazy. If a machine jammed, he wouldn't fix it. He would walk away and tell an assistant to deal with it in the morning. I knelt down, my knees cracking on the hardwood floor. I shone the light into the mouth of the machine. There, stuck between the blades, was a thick sheaf of papers. He had tried to force too many pages through at once. I reached in. The blades were sharp. One slip, and I would lose a finger. I took a deep breath, steadying my shaking hand. I grabbed the edge of the paper and pulled. It didn't move. I pulled harder, wiggling it side to side. "Come on," I whispered. "Come on." With a tearing sound, the paper gave way. I pulled out a crumpled, partially shredded document. The top third was mangled, but the body of the text was intact. I smoothed it out on the floor, shining my light on the words. The header was in bold red letters. Project Phoenix, Confidential Strategic Realignment. I started to read, and as I read, the fear that had been gripping my heart evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, heavy sensation that started in my gut and spread to my fingertips. The document wasn't a business plan. It was a slaughter. Phase 1, immediate liquidation of the commercial fleet. Buyer identified Global Haulage Corp. Price agreed $12 million. Phase 2, termination of all 215 drivers and warehouse staff. Pension fund to be dissolved and used to cover severance liabilities, with remaining surplus transferred to executive bonus pool. Phase 3, sale of land assets. The logistics center land to be rezoned for residential development. Buyer Greg Miller Real Estate Group. Purpose luxury condominiums. I felt sick. Greg, my son-in-law. He wasn't just a failure. He was a conspirator. They were going to bulldoze the warehouse firemen like Bob, who had kids in college, and build condos for yuppies. But it was the final paragraph that made the world stop spinning. Phase 4, management of legacy liability. Subject Harrison Blackwood. I leaned closer, my eyes straining in the dim light. Due to cognitive decline, subject will be transferred to long-term care. Facility selected Sunset Meadows State Home. Cost efficiency is priority. Private assets to be seized under guardianship order to fund Project Phoenix legal fees. Sunset Meadows. I knew that place. It was a warehouse for the dying. It was a place where old people were strapped to beds and medicated into silence, where the stench of urine and bleach hung in the air, and where the state sent people who had no one left to love them. They weren't just stealing my money. They were throwing me into the garbage. They were going to erase me. I sat there on the floor of my old office holding the paper that signed my death warrant. A tear fell from my eye and landed on the page, blurring the word Phoenix. But it was the only tear. I wiped my face. I stood up. My knees didn't hurt anymore. My heart wasn't racing. My hands were perfectly steady. I folded the paper and placed it carefully into the inside pocket of my jacket, right next to my heart. For the last 3 days I had been mourning. I had been grieving my wife. I had been grieving the loss of the relationship with my children. I had been asking myself what I did wrong, how I failed them, why they didn't love me. But reading those words, I realized something. I wasn't their father anymore. And they weren't my children. They were enemies. I looked at the glass desk. I looked at the view of the city skyline through the window. I switched off my flashlight. I didn't need it anymore. I knew the way out. The sadness was gone. In its place was something sharp, cold, and incredibly clear. I was a mechanic. I fixed things. And when a part was rotten, you didn't polish it. You didn't argue with it. You cut it out. I walked to the door. I wasn't sneaking anymore. I was hunting. I had the evidence. I had the motivation. And thanks to their arrogance, I had the element of surprise. Project Phoenix. I thought a grim smile touching my lips as I stepped back into the shadows of the hallway. You want to see something rise from the ashes, just wait until the sun comes up. I drove to the one place in the city where I knew Preston would never set foot. It was a 24-hour diner called the Rusty Spoon, located right off the interstate exit ramp. It was the kind of place where the coffee tasted like battery acid and the menu was sticky with years of spilled syrup. But it was also the place where I had signed my first major contract 30 years ago. I parked my truck in the back between a dumpster and a rusted sedan and pulled my collar up. I felt like a fugitive in my own town. Inside, the air smelled of bacon grease and stale cigarette smoke. Sitting in the back booth, hidden by the shadows, was Sarah Jenkins. She did not look like the high-priced sharks Preston employed. She wore a simple gray blazer and had her hair tied back in a messy bun. She was the daughter of my first foreman, a man who had taught me how to weld when I was 18. Sarah had clawed her way through law school at night while working 2 jobs. She was tough, she was loyal, and most importantly, she hated bullies. "Harrison," she said as I slid into the booth opposite her. She didn't offer a hug. She knew I wasn't in the mood for pleasantries. She just pushed a steaming mug of black coffee toward me. "You look like hell." "I feel like it," I grunted, taking a sip. The bitter heat was grounding. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the crumpled document I had stolen from the shredder. I slid it across the chipped Formica table. Read this. Sarah put on her reading glasses. As she scanned the page, her expression shifted from professional curiosity to pure disgust. Her jaw tightened. Project Phoenix, she whispered, shaking her head. They are not just pushing you out. They are stripping the company for parts, selling the fleet, firing the drivers. Harrison. This is a liquidation sale disguised as a restructuring plan. And this part about the nursing home, this is evil. I know, I said, staring into my coffee cup. They gave me 24 hours to sign a voluntary resignation. If I don't, they file for guardianship tomorrow at noon. They will paint me as senile. With this document, I know they aren't bluffing. So we fight, Sarah said, slamming her hand on the table, making the silverware rattle. We take this to a judge. We show them the conspiracy. And say what? I asked, my voice weary. That I broke into the office at 2 a.m., that I stole documents. Preston will spin that as proof of my erratic behavior. He has the board in his pocket. He has the bank freezing my accounts. By the time a judge hears our side, I will be in a locked ward at Sunset Meadows and the company will be sold. I leaned back, feeling the weight of 70 years pressing down on my chest. I need a way out, Sarah. I need a lever. Sarah didn't answer immediately. She opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of yellowed files. These were the original incorporation papers I had given her for safekeeping years ago, back when Elizabeth first got sick. She started flipping through them, her eyes darting back and forth. Harrison, take me back to 1995, she said suddenly. 95, I asked. That was the year we expanded. Why I am looking at the restructuring you did when you bought the land for the main distribution center, she said, her finger tracing a line on a faded legal document. You were worried about liability lawsuits because of that accident on the turnpike. You wanted to protect the real estate from the operational risks of the trucking business. Yeah, I remembered. My accountant told me to separate the assets. We created 2 entities. Exactly. Sarah said, looking up at me. Her eyes were gleaming with a sharp, dangerous intelligence. You created Blackwood Logistics Incorporated to run the trucks, handle the payroll, and manage the contracts. That is the company Preston is the vice president of. That is the company the board controls. She flipped another page. But you also created Blackwood Land Holdings LLC, she continued. This entity owns the dirt. It owns the 20 acres under the warehouse. It owns the parking lot where the trucks sleep. It owns the land the office tower sits on. So I shrugged. It is all part of the same pot. No, Harrison. It is not, Sarah, said her voice rising with excitement. She turned the document around so I could see it. Look at the ownership structure of the Land Holdings LLC. Who is listed as the sole member? I squinted at the paper. Harrison Blackwood. Just me. No Elizabeth. No partners. Just me. And here is the lease agreement, Sarah said, pulling out another document. This is a commercial lease between your land company and the logistics company. You signed it 30 years ago. It is a standard triple net lease, but look at Clause 14. I leaned in. Clause 14, change of control. It says that the lease is valid only as long as Harrison Blackwood maintains a controlling interest in the tenant company, Sarah read aloud. In the event of a change in ownership or control of Blackwood Logistics, Inc., this lease automatically terminates effective immediately unless the landlord grants a written extension. I stared at the words. I read them again, and then again. My brain, which had been foggy with grief and stress, suddenly snapped into focus. Preston is trying to take Blackwood Logistics, I said slowly. He wants the brand, the contracts, the trucks. Yes, Sarah said, a smile slowly spreading across her face. He is buying the car, Harrison, but he forgot that he doesn't own the road. If he forces you out, if he takes your shares and assumes control, the lease breaks. The company is trespassing on your land the second the ink is dry. I sat back, letting the realization wash over me. Preston had an MBA from Harvard. He had high-priced lawyers. They had looked at the profit and loss statements. They had looked at the stock price. But they hadn't looked at the dusty deed in the basement of the county clerk's office. They assumed arrogantly that the company owned its headquarters. "He doesn't know," I whispered. "He doesn't know," Sarah confirmed. "He is so focused on stealing the business, he didn't check the foundation." A laugh bubbled up in my chest. It started low and turned into something dark and satisfying. The waitress at the counter looked over concerned, but I didn't care. If the lease terminates, I said, my mind racing with the possibilities. What happens to the assets on the property? If they don't vacate within the notice period, usually 24 to 48 hours, you can seize them to cover unpaid rent or damages, Sarah said. Or you can simply lock the gates. Without a depot, the trucks can't load. Without the server room in the basement, the software goes dark. The company's value drops to zero overnight. I looked at the crumpled Project Phoenix paper. They wanted to ruin me. They wanted to sell my life's work for scrap. "Sarah," I said, my voice steady and cold. "Draft the resignation papers." "What?" Sarah blinked. "But we have him. We can threaten him with this." "No," I said. "I don't want to threaten him. If I warn him, he will find a loophole. He will drag it out in court. He will find a way to rezone or claim adverse possession. I want him to sign. I want him to think he has won." I leaned forward, looking Sarah dead in the eye. "I want to give him exactly what he asked for. I will sign over the company. I will sign over the voting rights. I will let him sit in that big chair and pop the champagne. And the moment he thinks I am finished, the moment he thinks I am nothing but a senile old man on his way to a nursing home, I want you to hand him the eviction notice." Sarah stared at me for a long moment. Then she closed the folder. The concern in her eyes was gone, replaced by the steely resolve of a soldier going into battle. "I will have the papers ready by 8 a.m., she said. I finished my coffee. It didn't taste bitter anymore. It tasted like fuel. I stood up and threw a $20 bill on the table. "Let's go, Sarah," I said. "I have a performance to prepare for. I need to look like a beaten man." I walked out of the diner into the early morning light. The rain had stopped. The air was crisp. I got into my truck and checked my reflection in the rearview mirror. I ruffled my hair. I let my shoulders slump. I practiced a vacant, confused stare. Preston wanted a senile father. I would give him an Oscar-winning performance. I drove back toward the estate, not as a victim returning to his prison, but as a Trojan horse rolling up to the gates of Troy. They were going to let me in, they were going to celebrate their victory, and they were going to have no idea that the city was already burning. I stood in front of the small cracked mirror in the guest house bathroom. The man staring back at me looked too strong, too alert. That would not do. I reached up and messed up my hair, pulling tufts of gray in different directions until I looked unkempt. I took out my false teeth, the ones I rarely went without, and placed them in a glass of water. My cheeks sank in slightly, giving me a hollow, aged look. Then I put on my oldest pair of flannel pajamas, the ones with the coffee stain on the lapel, and an oversized cardigan that hung loosely off my shoulders. I practiced my walk. I hunched my back, rounding my shoulders forward, and shuffled across the linoleum floor, dragging my left foot just a little. I let my hands tremble. It was a cruel irony. Yesterday I had fought to hide the trembling. Today I was manufacturing it. I called Preston. My voice on the phone was a masterpiece of frailty. "Preston," I wheezed. "Can you and your sister come down to the cottage? I cannot find my glasses, and I think I am ready to sign. I just want this to be over." He arrived 10 minutes later, Tiffany trailing behind him like a bored shadow. They didn't knock. They just pushed the door open, bringing a gust of expensive perfume and arrogance into my humble sanctuary. "It smells like mothballs in here." Tiffany wrinkled her nose, refusing to sit on the worn sofa. She stood by the door, tapping her foot, checking her watch. Preston walked in, holding a leather portfolio. He looked at me, sitting on the edge of the bed in my pajamas, and I saw the tension leave his shoulders. He didn't see a threat anymore. He saw a broken old man. "We brought the papers," Harrison Preston said, his voice loud and slow, as if he were speaking to a child. "Do you understand what we are doing today?" I looked up at him, blinking rapidly. "Is that you, Peter?" I asked, squinting. "It is Preston Harrison," he corrected, a flash of annoyance crossing his face. "Your stepson." Right, Preston," I muttered, looking down at my shaking hands. "I am sorry. My head. It is all foggy today. I just want to rest. I promised Elizabeth I would rest." Tiffany rolled her eyes. "Oh my God, he is losing it faster than we thought," she whispered to Preston. "Just get him to sign before he forgets how to write his name." Preston pulled a chair over and sat in front of me. He opened the portfolio and laid the documents on the small, wobbly nightstand. "This is the transfer of authority, Harrison," he said, pointing to the signature line. "And this is the resignation from the board. Once you sign these, we will wire the first installment of your allowance to the nursing home. They have a nice garden there. You will like it." I reached for the pen, my hand shaking so violently that I dropped it. Preston sighed, picked it up, and placed it firmly between my fingers. "I will sign," I said, my voice trembling. "I am too old to fight you, son. You are right. The business needs young blood. New ideas. I am just a relic." I leaned forward, the pen hovering over the paper. Then I stopped. I pulled my hand back. Preston stiffened. "What is it?" he asked sharply. I have one condition," I said, looking from him to Tiffany. "A small thing." Tiffany groaned. "We don't have time for this. What do you want?" "More money." No money," I said softly. "I don't need money where I am going. I want my old truck, the Ford, and I want a place to grow some tomatoes." "Your truck?" Preston laughed. "That piece of junk, you can have it. We were going to scrap it anyway. And the land." I continued, pointing a shaky finger out the window toward the back of the logistics facility. "You know that rocky patch behind the warehouses? The one where nothing grows but weeds. It is full of gravel, useless for building. But I think if I clear the stones, I could plant a little garden. Just something to keep my hands busy." Preston looked at me, confused. He knew the property map, or so he thought. He knew the main complex, the office tower, the parking lots. But the rear acre? It was listed as undeveloped agricultural waste. It was a jagged strip of land full of old concrete slabs and gravel. "You want the wasteland?" Preston asked, raising an eyebrow. "Why, it is not worth anything." "Sentimental value," I whispered, looking down. "Your mother and we used to have picnics there before the business got big. I just want to own that little piece of dirt. It makes me feel close to her." Preston looked at Tiffany. She shrugged. "Let him have it," she said. "It is literally dirt, Preston. If it gets him to sign the $40 million company over to us, give him his pile of rocks." Preston pulled out his phone. He called the lawyer Montgomery. "Draft a quick addendum," Preston said into the phone. "Harrison keeps the 1990 Ford pickup and what is the parcel number?" He looked at me. I fumbled in my pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper where I had written the parcel ID number. I had memorized it 30 years ago, but I pretended to struggle to read my own handwriting. "It is parcel 04. B," I stammered. "Parcel 04B. Preston repeated into the phone. Yeah, the undeveloped lot at the rear. Transfer the deed to him. Yes, today. Just get it done. He hung up and looked at me with a smirk. Done, he said. You get your truck and your dirt. Now sign. I took the pen again. I let out a long, shuddering breath. I lowered the pen to the paper. I signed my name. Not the strong, bold signature I used on contracts, but a wavery, scratching scrawl that barely looked legible. There, I whispered, dropping the pen. It is yours. Everything is yours. Preston snatched the papers away before the ink was even dry. He checked the signature, his eyes gleaming with triumph. He stood up, towering over me. You made the right choice, Harrison, he said. You are going to be much happier with no responsibilities. We will have someone come pick you up in the morning to take you to Sunset Meadows. Pack light. The rooms are small. Tiffany was already at the door. Finally, she muttered, I am going to call the realtor. We can list the house tomorrow. They walked out without saying goodbye. They didn't look back at the old man sitting on the bed in his pajamas. They were too busy high-fiving each other in the driveway. I waited until I heard the limousine engine fade into the distance. Then I stood up. I walked to the bathroom and spat out the cotton balls I had tucked into my cheeks to make them look sunken. I put my teeth back in. I washed the coffee stain off my face. I walked to the window and looked out at the wasteland I had just fought for. Preston thought it was just rocks and weeds. He didn't know that the wasteland was legally defined as the access road and the ground beneath the main server junction. He didn't know that without that strip of gravel, no truck could enter the loading bay and no data could leave the building. I took off the cardigan and threw it on the floor. I stood straight, stretching my back until it cracked. The performance was over. The critics had raved. Now it was time for the curtain call. I picked up my phone and dialed Sarah. Did they file the deed transfer? I asked. I am looking at the county clerk's portal right now. Sarah's voice came through sharp and excited. Montgomery just uploaded it electronically to expedite the closing. It is official, Harrison. You own Parcel 04B, and the resignation is filed. Good, I said, my voice dropping to a low growl. Prepare the eviction notice. I want it served tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. sharp. But Harrison, Sarah paused. Tomorrow is the board meeting to announce the takeover. I know, I said, a cold smile touching my lips. That is why I am bringing the police. I want everyone to see what happens when you trespass on my land. I hung up the phone. I looked around the small guest house one last time. I wouldn't be sleeping here tonight. I had a truck to pack. And tomorrow I had an empire to reclaim. They wanted to send me to Sunset Meadows. I was about to send them to hell. The next morning, the sun was already baking the asphalt of the main loading bay when the black limousine rolled through the gates. It looked like a hearse arriving at a picnic, sleek and shiny and completely out of place among the grime and the heavy machinery. I was standing by the guard shack wearing my old faded windbreaker and a baseball cap pulled low over my eyes. I watched them step out. First Preston adjusting his silk tie in the reflection of the car window. Then Greg wearing sunglasses that probably cost more than my first truck. And finally, Montgomery, the lawyer, clutching his briefcase to his chest as if he were afraid the air in the trucking yard might steal his billable hours. They did not see me at first. I was just part of the scenery to them now, like a rusted bollard or a discarded tire. I fell into step behind them, keeping my distance, slouching my shoulders to maintain the illusion of the broken, senile old man they believed I was. This place is a disaster, Greg said loudly, wrinkling his nose as the smell of diesel and hot rubber hit him. How did he operate in this filth for 40 years? I am going to have to burn these shoes. He looked down at his Italian loafers. They were coated in a fine layer of gray dust. I stifled a smile. That dust was the lifeblood of this company. It was the residue of millions of miles driven and thousands of tons of cargo moved. To him, it was just dirt. Preston laughed, a dry, humorless sound. We will pave it over, Greg. Once we sell the fleet, this will all be luxury condos. No more dust. Just clean filtered air and high HOA fees. They walked toward the main lineup where the drivers were conducting their morning inspections. These were men I had known for decades. Men with families, mortgages, and bad backs from years of sitting in a cab to put food on the table. Look at them, Preston sneered, pointing a manicured finger at Big Mike, a driver who had been with me since '95. He is checking the oil manually. Why isn't he using the digital diagnostic tool inefficient? He is checking the oil manually because he knows that sensors can lie, but the dipstick tells the truth, I thought. But I bit my tongue. That one there, Montgomery said, gesturing with his pen toward Sam, who was walking with a slight limp. Workers' compensation risk. You will want to terminate him immediately. We can structure it as a layoff due to downsizing to avoid a wrongful termination suit. Preston nodded, taking mental notes. Agreed. Cut the bottom 20% of the seniority list first. They have the highest pensions. If we fire them before the quarter ends, we save $3 million on the balance sheet. I felt a fire burning in my chest so hot, I thought it would melt the buttons of my shirt. They were talking about human beings like they were line items on a spreadsheet. Sam had that limp because he slipped on ice securing a load in Minnesota during a blizzard to make sure a hospital got their medical supplies on time. He was a hero. To them, he was a liability. I kept walking, my head bowed, staring at the gravel crunching under my boots. I had to endure this. I had to let them show me exactly who they were. They continued their tour, nitpicking everything. The paint on the warehouse was peeling. The vending machine in the break room was too old. The safety posters were outdated. They saw flaws. I saw history. Finally, we reached the rear of the property. We stood at the edge of the paved lot where the asphalt ended, and the rough, weed-choked gravel began. This was the boundary, the line in the sand. Beyond this point lay Parcel 04B, the land I had fought to keep, the land they thought was worthless. They stopped. Greg took off his sunglasses and stared out at the stretch of rocky ground that ran behind the main server building and the primary entrance gate. So this is it, Greg said, kicking a loose stone with his expensive shoe. This is the kingdom the old man negotiated for. A strip of garbage land. Preston chuckled. Let him have it. It kept him quiet. Besides, look at it. It is an eyesore. Greg turned to Preston, a cruel grin spreading across his face. You know what we should do until the city approves the rezoning permits for the condos? We can use this strip as a temporary dump site. We have got all that old office furniture and the scrap metal from the trucks we are going to strip. Just pile it all up right here. He swept his hand across the air, imagining piles of trash on my land. Let the old man sit on his porch and look at our garbage, Greg laughed. It will remind him of his place. I stood 5 feet behind them. My hand went into the pocket of my windbreaker. I squeezed my fist so hard my fingernails dug into my palm. I wanted to hit him. I wanted to shatter that grin with a right hook that carried 50 years of hard labor behind it. But I didn't. I breathed in the smell of the diesel. I breathed in the dust. The dump, I repeated in my head. You want to use my land as a dump? Preston turned around, finally acknowledging my presence. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and triumph. Well, Harrison, he said, I hope you enjoy your retirement. We have a lot of work to do cleaning up this mess you made. Don't worry about the noise. Progress is loud. I looked up at him. I let my eyes stay cloudy, my mouth slightly open. I just want to grow my tomatoes, I mumbled. Preston patted my shoulder. It was a patronizing, dismissive tap. Sure, Dad, he said. You go grow your tomatoes. We will handle the real work. They turned their backs on me and walked away, heading toward the air-conditioned sanctuary of the office tower. I watched them go. I watched the way they walked, confident, arrogant masters of the universe. They didn't know. They didn't know that the ground they were standing on, the only entrance to the facility, belonged to Parcel 04B. They didn't know that the fiber optic cables that ran the entire company's network were buried 3 feet beneath the very gravel Greg had just kicked. They didn't know that by insults and arrogance they had just given me the moral permission to destroy them completely. I waited until they disappeared inside the building. Then I pulled my hand out of my pocket. I wasn't making a fist anymore. My hand was open, and it was steady. I looked at the strip of land. My land. "You think this is a dump, Greg?" I whispered to the empty air. "No. This isn't a dump. This is a siege line." I turned and walked toward my truck. The tour was over. The inspection was complete. They had seen what they wanted to see. Now it was time for them to see what they had missed. I checked my watch. 9 a.m. was approaching. Sarah would be at the courthouse. The eviction notice was ready. I climbed into the cab of my old Ford. It smelled like oil and old coffee, a smell that felt like home. I started the engine. It roared to life, loud and defiant. "Let's see how much progress you can make, Preston," I said, as I put the truck in gear when you can't even get through the front gate. The boardroom was cold, artificially cooled to a temperature that made the sweat on my back feel like ice. It was the same room where I had negotiated million-dollar contracts, where I had stared down union reps and hostile competitors. But today, the atmosphere was different. It did not smell of work or coffee. It smelled of chilled champagne and expensive cologne, the scent of a victory lap taken before the race was even finished. I sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, a piece of furniture I had commissioned from an Amish carpenter 20 years ago. It was solid, honest wood. The people sitting around it were neither. Preston sat at the head of the table, my seat. He looked like a king who had just conquered a new territory, leaning back in the leather chair, spinning a gold pen between his fingers. Tiffany was to his right, scrolling through her phone, the blue light reflecting off her oversized sunglasses. And across from me sat Montgomery, the lawyer, a man whose smile never quite reached his eyes. In the center of the table, sitting in a silver bucket that was sweating condensation onto the polished wood, was a bottle of Dom Perignon. They were ready to toast. They were ready to celebrate the end of Harrison Blackwood. Montgomery cleared his throat, a dry, scratching sound. He pushed a stack of documents toward me. It was a thick pile, easily 3 inches high, bound with heavy clips. "These are the final transfer documents, Mr. Blackwood." Montgomery said, his voice smooth and devoid of emotion. "As discussed, this package includes the irrevocable transfer of all Class A voting shares of Blackwood Logistics, Inc., to Preston Vance and Tiffany Vance. It also includes your voluntary resignation as chairman of the board and the termination of your executive employment contract." He tapped the top page with a manicured fingernail. "We have flagged the signature pages with yellow tabs. There are 42 signatures required. 42 times I had to sign my name to erase my life's work." I looked at the stack of papers. To them, it was just legal jargon. To me, it was a timeline. Page 1 was the fleet of trucks I bought in '85. Page 10 was the expansion into the Midwest. Page 20 was the pension fund I fought to protect. I reached out for the pen Montgomery offered. It was a heavy black Mont Blanc. My hand trembled. I let it shake. I let the tremors travel from my wrist up to my shoulder, making my whole arm vibrate like a loose exhaust pipe. I gripped the pen, but my fingers were slick with sweat. I fumbled. The pen slipped from my grasp and clattered onto the table, rolling away toward Tiffany. "Oops," I muttered, staring at my empty hand. "I am sorry. My grip, it is not what it used to be." Tiffany let out a loud, exasperated sigh. She stopped scrolling on her phone and looked at the pen as if it were a dead cockroach. "Jesus, Harrison," she snapped. "Just pick it up. I have a nail appointment at 2 o'clock, and my technician charges a cancellation fee. Can we speed this up?" She didn't care that her stepfather was signing away his legacy. She cared about her cuticles. "I am trying, Tiffany," I whispered, reaching for the pen again. "I am trying." Preston watched me with a mixture of amusement and pity. He enjoyed this. He enjoyed seeing the strong man reduced to a fumbler. "Take your time, Harrison," Preston said, his voice dripping with false sweetness. "We want to make sure every signature is legible. We don't want the bank questioning your intent later." I retrieved the pen. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. I needed to make this look real. I needed to look defeated. I lowered the pen to the first yellow tab. The paper was smooth. I signed. The ink flowed black and permanent. Signature 1. The voting rights. Gone. I turned the page. Signature 2. The operational control. Gone. The room was silent save for the scratching of the nib against the paper and the rhythmic tapping of Tiffany's acrylic nail on the table. Scratch, tap, scratch, tap. It was the countdown to my destruction. As I worked my way through the stack, my mind drifted to the document tucked safely in the inside pocket of my jacket. The deed to Parcel 04B. The land underneath us. They thought they were taking the castle. They didn't know I had already removed the foundation. Sign, I told myself. Give them what they want. Feed the sharks so they stop swimming. Halfway through the stack, I stopped. I rubbed my eyes, feigning exhaustion. Is there water?" I asked, my voice cracking. Montgomery looked annoyed, but he poured a glass of water from a carafe and slid it over. I drank it slowly, making them wait. I saw Preston check his watch. Good. Let him sweat. Let him anticipate the prize. I finished the water and went back to signing. Signature 30. The intellectual property rights to the brand name. Signature 40. The non-compete agreement. Finally, I reached the last page. Signature 42. The resignation letter. I looked at the words. I, Harrison Blackwood, being of sound mind and body, hereby resign. Sound mind. If only they knew how sound my mind really was. I pressed the pen down hard, signing with a jagged, shaky scrawl that trailed off at the end. I dropped the pen. It hit the paper with a finality that echoed in the room. "It is done," I whispered, slumping back in my chair. Montgomery snatched the papers away instantly. He flipped through them rapidly, checking every tab, ensuring every line was filled. He looked up at Preston and nodded. "The documents are executed," Montgomery announced. "Congratulations, Mr. Vance. You are now the majority shareholder and chairman of Blackwood Logistics." The room seemed to brighten. The tension broke. Preston clapped his hands together, a loud, booming sound. "Excellent," he shouted. He reached for the champagne bottle. He popped the cork. It flew across the room and hit the wall, bouncing off the portrait of the company founders, me and Elizabeth. The irony was perfect. Greg, who had been standing quietly in the corner, stepped forward with 4 crystal flutes. Preston poured the foaming golden liquid. He handed a glass to Tiffany, one to Montgomery, and one to Greg. He did not pour one for me. To the future, Preston toasted, raising his glass high. To Project Phoenix, to Phoenix, they chorused. They drank. I sat there, my hands folded in my lap, watching them consume the expensive wine that my hard work had paid for. Preston set his glass down. The smile on his face shifted. It was no longer the polite smile of a son. It was the predator dropping the camouflage. "Thank you, Harrison," Preston said. He didn't look at me. He looked through me. "You have done the right thing." He walked over to me, extending his hand. For a second, I thought he wanted to shake hands. But his palm was open, waiting. "The keys, Harrison," he said coldly. "The master set. And the badge." I reached into my pocket. I pulled out the heavy brass ring. It held the key to the front door, the key to the executive suite, the key to the safe. It represented total access. I placed the keys in his hand. The metal chinked against his wedding ring. Preston closed his fist around them. He put them in his pocket. He patted the pocket, ensuring they were safe. Now he said, his tone brisk and dismissive, "About the transition. We have arranged for a car to take you to the facility tomorrow morning at 10. It is a nice place. Sunset Meadows. They have bingo on Tuesdays." Tiffany laughed, a cruel, sharp giggle. "Don't worry, Dad," she said, applying a fresh coat of lip gloss. "We picked the room with the view of the parking lot. You like trucks, right? You can watch the delivery vans." Preston checked his watch again. "We have a board meeting in 5 minutes to announce the leadership change," he said. "Montgomery, please escort Mr. Blackwood to the lobby. He doesn't have security clearance for the executive floor anymore. He didn't even look me in the eye. He just turned his back and walked toward the window, looking out at the city he thought he owned." I stood up slowly. My legs felt strong. My hands had stopped shaking. I looked at their backs. Preston admiring his reflection. Tiffany texting her nail technician. Greg refilling his glass. They were celebrating a harvest they didn't plant. I turned to Montgomery. He was holding the door open, looking bored. "After you, Mr. Blackwood," he said. I walked to the door. I paused for 1 second. I looked at the champagne bucket. I looked at the empty chair where I had sat for 40 years. "Goodbye, Preston," I said softly. He didn't turn around. He just waved a hand over his shoulder, a gesture of dismissal. "Goodbye, Harrison," he said. "Try not to get lost on the way out." I walked out into the hallway. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind me. I heard laughter erupt from inside the room. They were laughing at the old fool. They were laughing at how easy it was. I walked down the corridor, my footsteps silent on the carpet. I reached the elevator. I pressed the button. As the doors opened, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the mirrored panel. I wasn't smiling, but my eyes were bright. They were burning with a cold, hard fire. They had the company. They had the stock. They had the keys. But they had forgotten to check the map. I stepped into the elevator. The descent began. But I wasn't going down. I was just going to the ground floor to wait. To wait for the moment when the castle they just stole would crumble into the dust of Parcel 04B. The red wedding was over, but the war had just begun. And tomorrow I was going to bring the thunder. The elevator doors slid shut, cutting off the sound of their laughter. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with the scent of Montgomery's expensive cologne and the metallic tang of my own adrenaline. I stood next to the lawyer who had just engineered the theft of my life's work. He didn't look at me. He was busy tapping away on his phone, scrolling through emails, humming a tune that sounded vaguely like a funeral march. To him, I was no longer Harrison Blackwood, the founder, the chairman, the man who had signed his paychecks for a decade. I was just a loose end that had been successfully tied off. I watched the floor numbers count down on the digital display. 50, 49, 48. Every floor represented a layer of the empire I built. The sales department on 40. The logistics coordinators on 30. The IT server rooms on 20. I was descending through the skeleton of my own creation, falling from the sky like a stone cast out of heaven. Montgomery cleared his throat. He did not look up from his screen. "Mr. Blackwood," he said, his voice flat and professional, "I trust you have made arrangements for your transportation. The company driver is, of course, reserved for executive staff only." I stared at the back of his head. "I have my truck," I said. "Ah, yes, the truck." Montgomery chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "Quaint." The elevator hit the lobby level with a soft chime. The doors opened, revealing the bustling heart of Blackwood Logistics. It was the mid-morning rush. Couriers were running packages through the turnstiles. Drivers were waiting near the dispatch desk with clipboards. The air smelled of floor wax and stale coffee, a smell that had been the background of my life for 40 years. I stepped out, my boots clicking on the terrazzo floor. I expected Montgomery to walk me to the door and bid me a fake, polite farewell. But he stopped abruptly near the security station. He turned to me, and for the first time he looked me in the eye. There was no sympathy there, only the cold, dead calculation of a reptile. "There is one more thing, Harrison," he said. He dropped the formal title. I was just Harrison now, regarding the transition package we discussed upstairs, the monthly stipend, the medical coverage at Sunset Meadows. I waited. I knew this was coming. I had read the Project Phoenix file. I knew the blade was about to fall, but I wanted to see him wield it. "Yes," I asked. "Preston, excuse me, Chairman Vance, has ordered an immediate audit of all legacy financial commitments," Montgomery said, adjusting his glasses. "Given the liquidity crisis the company is facing, the board has voted to suspend all non-essential payouts effective immediately." He smiled, a thin stretching of his lips that didn't reach his eyes. "That includes your pension and the nursing home fees," he continued. "It is a matter of fiduciary duty. We cannot justify paying a retired inactive member of the family when we are cutting costs to save the business. I am sure you understand. It is strictly business." Strictly business. The words hung in the air like smoke. They were taking the company, the house, the savings, and now they were cutting the lifeline they had promised 5 minutes ago. They weren't just firing me. They were erasing me. They were ensuring I would die destitute. I looked at him. I didn't blink. "So the contract I just signed," I said slowly. "The one where I gave up everything in exchange for that care. You are voiding it." "We are not voiding it," Montgomery corrected smoothly. "We are simply restructuring the payment schedule, indefinitely. You are on your own, Harrison." I nodded. Good. They had removed the last shred of moral ambiguity. If I had felt even a twinge of guilt about what I was about to do to them, it vanished right then and there. They were not family. They were parasites. And you do not negotiate with parasites. You burn them out. Montgomery turned to the security desk. Standing there was the new head of security, a man named Bronson. He was a giant, a wall of muscle stuffed into a uniform that was 2 sizes too small. He had a neck as thick as a tree trunk, and eyes that looked like they enjoyed hurting people. Bronson Montgomery snapped his fingers. "Please escort Mr. Blackwood to the exit. Ensure he does not speak to any employees. We do not want a scene. And deactivate his badge immediately." Bronson stepped forward. He loomed over me, casting a shadow that covered my face. He smirked. He knew who I was. Everyone knew who I was. But to him, I was just yesterday's trash that needed to be taken out to the curb. "Let's go, old man." Bronson grunted. He reached out and grabbed my arm. His grip was hard, painful. He dug his fingers into my bicep, expecting me to wince. I didn't wince. I had changed tires on 18-wheelers in freezing rain. I had wrestled engine blocks into place with my bare hands. My arms were not soft. I looked at his hand on my arm. Then I looked up at his face. "Take your hand off me, son," I said. My voice was low, barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of 50 years of command. Bronson blinked. He hesitated. He saw something in my eyes that he didn't expect. He saw the wolf. He let go, taking a half step back. "Walk," he barked, trying to regain his authority. "Before I drag you." I adjusted my jacket. I brushed the spot where he had touched me. I began to walk toward the glass doors. The lobby had gone quiet. The receptionists had stopped typing. The drivers had stopped talking. They were watching. They were witnessing the fall of the king. I kept my head high. I did not look at the floor. I looked straight ahead at the sunlight streaming through the glass. Just as I reached the revolving doors, Montgomery's phone rang. It was a loud, piercing ringtone. He answered it immediately, putting it on speakerphone as he fumbled to put a file back in his briefcase. Preston's voice boomed through the quiet lobby, echoing off the marble walls. "Montgomery, is he gone?" "He is leaving the building now, Mr. Vance," Montgomery replied, shouting slightly to be heard. "Good," Preston said. His voice was frantic, excited high on the adrenaline of the kill. "Listen to me. I have the Vulture Fund on the other line. We are closing the deal on the fleet." I stopped. My hand froze inches from the door handle. The fleet. My trucks. The Peterbilts and Kenworths I had named after constellations. "Tell them we accept the 12 million, Preston shouted. "Tell them to send the recovery teams to the main yard on Friday. I want every tractor and trailer gone. We are liquidating the rolling stock." 12 million. He was selling a fleet worth 40 million for 12. He was selling it for scrap price just to get quick cash to pay his gambling debts and fund his lifestyle. And Montgomery Preston added, "Yes, sir, call the developers. Tell them I want the ground broken on the condos next week. Bulldoze the maintenance shed first. It is an eyesore." The maintenance shed. The place where I had built this company. The place where I had taught Preston how to change his first tire, a lesson he clearly never learned. I stood there listening to him sell my soul, piece by piece. The receptionists heard it. The drivers heard it. Everyone heard the new owner stripping the carcass of the company before the body was even cold. "Understood," Mr. Vance Montgomery said. "I will handle it." I pushed the door open. The blast of heat from the asphalt hit me like a physical blow. I stepped out onto the sidewalk, the glass doors sliding shut behind me, sealing me out of the air-conditioned world I had built. I walked to the edge of the curb and stopped. I didn't go to my truck. Not yet. I turned around and looked up at the tower. It was a monolith of blue glass and steel reflecting the harsh midday sun. On the top floor in the corner office, I could see a silhouette standing by the window. It was Preston. He was looking down at me. He was probably holding a glass of my champagne. He was probably laughing. He thought he saw a broken old man evicted penniless and alone. He thought the game was over. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my old Timex watch. The crystal was scratched and the leather strap was worn, but it was relentless. It never stopped. I watched the second hand sweep past the 12. 10 o'clock. Preston had his 5 minutes of victory. That was all I was willing to give him. I looked down the long, winding driveway that led up to the complex. Shimmering in the heat haze, I saw them. First the black sedan, unmarked, efficient. Then the white van with the county seal on the door. And behind them, a tow truck. A massive, heavy-duty wrecker, the kind used to drag semi-trucks out of ditches. Sarah was not just punctual. She was thorough. I lowered my watch. A smile touched my lips. It wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile of a demolition expert who just pressed the detonator. "You want to sell the fleet, Preston," I whispered to the glass tower. "You want to bulldoze the shed, you have to get past me first." I turned my back on the building. I walked to the center of the driveway entrance, the dividing line between the public road and the private property. My property. Parcel 04B. I planted my boots on the white line. I crossed my arms over my chest. I stood there, a solitary figure against the oncoming convoy. The lead car slowed down as it approached. The window rolled down. Sarah Jenkins looked out her sunglasses, reflecting the anger in my eyes. She didn't smile. She just nodded. "Ready, Harrison?" she asked. I looked at the eviction notice in her hand. I looked at the deputies in the van. I looked at the tow truck driver who was already backing up toward the main gate. I took a deep breath. The air tasted of diesel and justice. I am not just ready, Sarah, I said, my voice steady as a rock. I am overdue. Serve the papers, and tell the tow truck driver to start with the Porsche in the reserved spot. It was time to show the world that you don't judge a book by its cover, and you never ever judge a landlord by his pajamas. The eviction of Blackwood Logistics had officially begun. Preston's hand was gripping the neck of the champagne bottle, and his thumb was poised over the cork, ready to release the pressure. The foil had already been peeled away and lay on the mahogany table like a discarded wrapper. He was beaming, looking from Tiffany to Greg, his face flushed with the intoxication of what he believed was a total victory. He opened his mouth to propose a toast to the new era of Blackwood Logistics, but the words never left his throat. The heavy double doors of the boardroom swung open with a force that made the glass walls vibrate. Sarah Jenkins walked in first. She did not look like a woman who had spent the morning filing motions in a dusty courthouse basement. She looked like an executioner who had just sharpened her blade. I walked in behind her, and the silence that fell over the room was absolute. Preston lowered the bottle slowly. His smile faltered, twitching at the corners as he tried to process why the man he had just evicted was standing in his private sanctuary. "Security!" Preston barked, his voice cracking slightly. "I thought I gave a direct order. Montgomery, get him out of here. He is trespassing." I did not say a word. I simply pulled out the chair at the far end of the table, the one opposite him, and sat down. I crossed my arms and nodded at Sarah. Sarah walked to the center of the room. She did not look at Preston. She did not look at Tiffany, who was staring at us with her mouth hanging open. Sarah looked directly at Montgomery. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a single document. It was not thick. It was not bound in leather. It was just 3 pages of standard legal paper stapled at the corner. She placed it on the table. The sound of the paper hitting the wood was softer than a whisper, but in that quiet room it sounded like a gavel striking a sounding block. "What is this?" Montgomery asked, his tone dripping with condescension as he reached for the paper. "If this is a wrongful termination suit, Ms. Jenkins, I suggest you mail it to my office. We are in the middle of a celebration." "It is not a lawsuit," Sarah said, her voice calm and deadly level. "It is an eviction notice." Preston laughed. It was a loud, nervous sound that bounced off the walls. "Eviction," he scoffed. "We own the building. We just signed the papers. The old man signed them himself. Did you forget to take your medication, Harrison? Do you need me to explain property law to you?" "Read the document, Montgomery," I said, my voice low and steady, filled with the gravel of 50 years on the road. "Read it out loud so everyone can hear." Montgomery sighed, rolling his eyes. He picked up the document with 2 fingers as if it were a soiled tissue. He adjusted his glasses, prepared to mock whatever desperate attempt I had made. He glanced at the header. "Commercial Ground Lease Agreement," he muttered. "Dated 1995. Landlord Blackwood Land Holdings. Tenant Blackwood Logistics." He flipped the page, looking bored. Then he stopped. I watched his face. It was a fascinating transformation. The boredom vanished instantly, replaced by a flicker of confusion. He squinted. He brought the paper closer to his face. A bead of sweat appeared on his forehead, right at the hairline. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. The blood began to drain from his cheeks, leaving his skin the color of old parchment. "What is it?" Preston asked, sensing the shift in the room. His arrogance was starting to crack. "What does it say?" Montgomery flipped to the next page. His hands started to shake. This wasn't the fake shaking I had performed earlier. This was real. This was the tremor of a man watching his career disintegrate in real time. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with horror. He realized then that he had made the fatal mistake of a lawyer who assumes he is the smartest person in the room. He had never checked the underlying land deeds. Clause 14, Sarah commanded. Read Clause 14. Montgomery swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed. He tried to speak, but his voice failed him. He cleared his throat and tried again. Clause 14, change of control, he read, his voice barely a whisper. In the event that the tenant undergoes a change in majority ownership or voting control without the express written consent of the landlord, this lease shall automatically and immediately terminate. He paused. The room was so quiet I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the corner. Keep reading, I said. Montgomery licked his dry lips. Upon termination, he continued, his voice shaking. The tenant shall have 24 hours to vacate the premises and remove all improvements, structures, and assets from the leased land. Failure to vacate will result in the immediate forfeiture of all assets remaining on the land to the landlord as liquidated damages for breach of contract. Preston slammed his hand on the table, making the champagne glasses jump. What the hell does that mean? He shouted, looking from Montgomery to me. We own the company. We own the headquarters. We own the warehouse. You own the company, yes, Sarah said, crossing her arms. You own the brand name. You own the employee contracts. But you do not own the land they sit on. You never did. Harrison separated the land assets 30 years ago. So what? Preston sneered, though. His voice was pitching higher. So we pay him rent. Big deal. We will pay the old man his rent. The lease is terminated, Preston, I said, leaning forward, and I am not renewing it. I stood up and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, pointing down at the sprawling complex below. You wanted the wasteland, remember? I asked softly. You gave me Parcel 04B because you thought it was just the rocky strip at the back, but you never looked at the survey map. I turned back to face him. Parcel 04B is not just the back lot. It is the 20 acres that sit directly under this tower. It is the land under the main distribution warehouse. It is the ground under the fueling station. It is the asphalt of the parking lot, where 500 trucks are currently parked. I leaned my hands on the table, looking him dead in the eye. You own the bricks, Preston. You own the steel beams and the glass windows, but I own the dirt holding them up. And according to the document your lawyer just read, you have exactly 23 hours and 50 minutes to move your tower, your warehouse, and your trucks off my land. Preston's face went red, a deep, violent crimson that started at his neck and flooded his cheeks. You can't do that, he screamed. That is impossible. We can't move a building. Then I guess you are forfeiting the building, I said calmly. Greg stood up, knocking his chair over. This is insane. We will sue you. We will get an injunction. On what grounds? Sarah asked. The contract is clear. You signed the change of control papers today. You triggered the clause. It is ironclad. And since Harrison is now the sole owner of the land and no longer has any fiduciary duty to the company, he has every right to evict a tenant he doesn't like. I watched Preston. The red in his face was draining away, replaced by a sickly, ghostly white. He slumped back in his chair, his hand slipping off the champagne bottle. He looked at Montgomery. Tell him he is lying, Preston whispered. Tell him this isn't real. Montgomery dropped the paper on the table. He took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. He looked like he had aged 10 years in 10 seconds. It is standard, Mr. Vance, Montgomery murmured. It is a standard asset protection clause. I did not pull the original lease. I assumed the company owned the fee simple title. You assumed I said, my voice cutting through the air like a whip. You assumed I was a stupid old man. You assumed I was senile. You were so busy stealing the fruit that you didn't notice I still owned the tree. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the crumpled eviction notice Sarah had prepared. I tossed it onto the table right on top of the resignation letter I had signed minutes ago. The sheriff deputies are in the hallway, I said. They are here to enforce the eviction. You have until 9 a.m. tomorrow to get your personal effects and your company off my property. I looked at Tiffany. She had dropped her phone. Her mouth was hanging open. "And Tiffany," I added. "Since the parking lot is on my land and your car is currently parked there without a permit, I am having it towed." Preston stared at me. His eyes were hollow. He looked at the champagne bottle, then at the eviction notice, then at me. The reality was crashing down on him. He had no warehouse. He had no office. He had no place to park the trucks he had just tried to sell. The assets he had leveraged to the Vulture Fund were now effectively worthless because they had nowhere to operate. "You planned this," he whispered. "You planned this whole thing. The shaking, the memory loss. It was all a lie." I didn't answer him. I didn't have to. The look on my face told him everything. I walked to the head of the table, my chair. I put my hand on the leather backrest. "Get out of my seat, Preston," I said. He didn't move at first. He just sat there, paralyzed by the magnitude of his failure. I said, "Get out!" I roared, my voice shaking the walls. Preston scrambled up. He moved so fast he tripped over his own feet. He backed away from the table, clutching his chest. I sat down. I sat in the chair I had built. I looked at the three of them, the greedy son, the vain daughter, the leech son-in-law, huddled together in the corner like frightened rats. "You wanted a war," I said, picking up the heavy Mont Blanc pen from the table. "You just lost. Now get off my land before I have you arrested for trespassing." The deadline passed in silence, but the consequences arrived with the noise of 1,000 thunderstorms. I did not wait for the sun to set before I enforced my property rights. I had hired a construction crew from the neighboring county men who knew me and respected the handshake deals of the past. By noon, they had erected a heavy chain-link fence across the main entrance of the logistics park. We placed concrete jersey barriers in front of the gate, rendering it impassable for any vehicle larger than a bicycle. I stood by the guard shack watching the chaos unfold, with the detached calm of a general observing a battlefield from a high hill. The first wave of trucks arrived at 1 o'clock. These were the long haulers coming in from the coast, laden with perishable goods and time-sensitive electronics. They pulled up to the gate, brakes hissing, only to find their path blocked by concrete and steel. The confusion was immediate. Drivers leaned out of their cabs, shouting into radios, asking dispatch what was happening. But dispatch had no answers because the dispatch center was located in the basement of the tower, and I had cut the fiber optic line that ran under my gravel at 12:30. The screens inside the tower had gone black. The phones were dead. The nervous system of Blackwood Logistics had been severed, leaving the brain in the penthouse completely isolated from the body on the ground. By 3 o'clock, the line of idling trucks stretched for 2 miles down the interstate access road. 150 tractor-trailers were gridlocked, unable to enter the yard, to offload, and unable to turn around. The air was thick with diesel fumes and the sound of air horns. The state patrol arrived to manage the traffic, but when Preston tried to order them to cut the fence, the officers simply shook their heads. They had seen the court order. They had seen the land survey. This was a civil dispute, and until a judge said otherwise, that fence was as legal as the border of a sovereign nation. Inside the glass tower, the panic was absolute. I could imagine the scene because I knew the business cycles better than my own heartbeat. At 4 o'clock, the client calls began to route to the personal cell phones of the executives because the landlines were down. Sarah showed me the newsfeed on her tablet as we sat on the porch of the guest house. The headline on the financial news network was flashing in red. Logistics giant paralyzed. Major supply chain disruption. The first domino to fall was Amazon. Their regional logistics manager, a man who demanded precision down to the second, called Preston. I was not in the room, but I heard about it later from a loyal secretary who was there. He screamed so loud he could be heard through the glass walls. They had missed the delivery window for the prime distribution hub. The penalty clauses in the contract kicked in immediately. $10,000 for every hour of delay. With 150 trucks stuck at the gate, the fines were racking up at a rate of $1 million an hour. Then came Walmart. They simply canceled the contract. They cited a breach of reliability clause. That contract was worth 40% of the company's annual revenue. In one phone call, 40% of the empire vanished. I watched the stock ticker on Sarah's phone. When the market opened that morning, Blackwood Logistics was trading at $45 a share. By lunch, it had dipped to $30 on rumors of the leadership change. But as news of the blockade and the contract cancellations hit the wire, the line on the graph looked like a cliff face: $20, $15, $8. At 5:00, the market closed, but the bleeding did not stop. The banks moved in for the kill. Preston had leveraged the company assets to the hilt to fund his hostile takeover and his gambling debts. He had borrowed against the stock value. Now that the stock was effectively worthless, the collateral had evaporated. The margin call came at 5:30. The bank demanded immediate repayment of the loans. $40 million due in full within 24 hours. If he could not pay, they would seize everything. But there was nothing to seize. The assets were trapped on land he did not own, and the cash flow had stopped. The sun began to set, casting long shadows over the line of stalled trucks. The drivers had turned off their engines. They were standing in groups by the roadside, smoking cigarettes, sharing rumors. They knew what was happening. They knew the old man had pulled the plug. Some of them even waved at me when they saw me standing on the porch. They were not angry at me. They knew a strike when they saw one. At 8:00, the headlights appeared in my driveway. It was not a limousine this time. It was Tiffany's sports car, the one I had threatened to tow. She drove it up onto the grass because the driveway was blocked by my own pickup truck. They spilled out of the car like refugees from a disaster. Preston looked like a man who had been physically beaten. His suit jacket was gone, his shirt was unbuttoned, and his hair was wild. Tiffany was crying, her mascara running down her cheeks in black streaks. Greg looked pale, shaking as if he were going into shock. They ran up the steps of the guest house. They did not barge in this time. They pounded on the door. A desperate, frantic rhythm. "Harrison, open up," Preston screamed. His voice was hoarse. "Dad, please. You have to stop this." I did not move from my chair. I was sitting in the small living room of the guest house, the place they had banished me to. On the table in front of me was the bottle of 1974 Cabernet Sauvignon, the one Greg had opened yesterday, the one he had called vinegar. I had retrieved it from the main house before the locks were changed. It had been breathing for 24 hours. I picked up the bottle and poured a generous glass. The wine was dark rich and smelled of black cherries and thyme. "Dad, please," Tiffany wailed from outside. "They are going to take everything. The bank is seizing my accounts. They are going to take my house. You can't let them do this." I took a sip of the wine. It was not vinegar. It was perfect. Complex, structured with a finish that lasted forever. It tasted like patience. I stood up and walked to the door. I unlocked it and opened it just a crack, leaving the safety chain on. They pressed their faces to the gap. Their eyes were wide, terrified. They smelled of sweat and fear. "Make it stop, Harrison," Preston begged, clutching the doorframe. "I will sign anything. I will give it back. Just open the gate. The penalties are bankrupting us. We will go to jail for fraud if we don't deliver those loads." I looked at him. I looked at the son who had called me senile. I looked at the daughter who had labeled my art for sale. I looked at the son-in-law who had planned to turn my land into a garbage dump. I took another slow sip of wine. "I am sorry, Preston," I said, my voice calm and polite. "I would love to help you. But I am just a retired old man. I don't have the authority. And besides, my lawyer tells me that opening that gate might expose me to liability." "Liability?" Greg shouted, hysterical. "We are dying out here. It is just business, Greg, I said, repeating the words Montgomery had used on me. Just business. But we are family, Tiffany sobbed, reaching through the crack to grab my sleeve. We are your family. I pulled my arm back gently. No, I said softly. You made it very clear yesterday. I am a guest, and guests don't interfere with the management. I looked at Preston one last time. You have 12 hours left to vacate my property, I said. I suggest you start carrying boxes. The sheriff comes back at 9 a.m. and he brings the lock cutters for the tower. I closed the door. I locked the deadbolt. I heard them screaming, pounding, begging. But I turned up the volume on the radio. It was playing an old country song about a man who lost everything and found himself. I sat back down in my chair and finished the glass of wine. It was the best glass of wine I had ever tasted. Outside, the empire was burning, but inside, the air conditioning was cool, and for the first time in a long time, I felt completely at peace. The night was young, and tomorrow I had a company to buy back for pennies on the dollar. The bankruptcy court was a sterile room filled with the smell of floor wax and desperation. It was a fitting end for the reign of King Preston. It had taken exactly 3 weeks for Blackwood Logistics to collapse completely. Without access to the facility, without contracts, and with creditors circling like sharks in bloody water, the company had no choice but to file for Chapter 7 liquidation. I sat in the back row wearing my best suit. It was the same suit I had worn to Elizabeth's funeral. I watched as the auctioneer read through the list of assets: office furniture, computers, intellectual property, and finally the fleet. The 500 trucks that Preston had tried to sell for scrap were now on the block tied up in litigation because they were parked on private land. My land. Preston and Tiffany were sitting in the front row with their lawyer Montgomery, but the arrogance was gone. They looked like ghosts. Preston was unshaven, his eyes red-rimmed from sleepless nights. Tiffany was not looking at her phone. She was staring at the floor, picking at a loose thread on her designer dress. They were broke. The banks had seized their personal accounts to cover the corporate guarantees they had foolishly signed. They had lost the penthouse. They had lost the sports cars. They had lost the illusion of wealth. I could hear them whispering. It wasn't a strategy session. It was a fight. You said this was foolproof, Tiffany hissed, her voice carrying in the quiet room. You said he was senile. You said we would be rich in a week. Now I have nothing. Even my jewelry is gone. Shut up, Tiffany, Preston snapped back. You were the one who wanted the quick cash. You were the one who pushed for the sale. It is your fault, Greg added from the other side. You are the CEO. You drove it into the ground. The judge banged his gavel, silencing them. It was pathetic. They were eating each other alive. The auctioneer cleared his throat. Lot number 42, he announced. The intellectual property client lists and rolling stock of Blackwood Logistics, Inc. opening bid is set at $2 million. $2 million. A company worth $40 million just a month ago. I raised my paddle. $2 million, I said. Heads turned. Preston spun around in his seat. When he saw me, his jaw dropped. He looked at me with a mixture of hatred and disbelief. He hadn't known I had liquid cash. He didn't know about the savings account I had kept secret for 30 years, the rainy day fund that Elizabeth and I had built separate from the business. $2 million going once the auctioneer droned. Does anyone else wish to bid silence? No one wanted to buy a trucking company whose assets were trapped behind a blockade. No one wanted to deal with a landlord who had already proven he was willing to go to war. I was the only bidder because I was the only one who held the keys to the gate. Sold, the auctioneer said, slamming his hammer down. To Mr. Harrison Blackwood. I stood up. I walked to the clerk's desk and wrote a check. It took every penny I had, but it was worth it. I wasn't just buying trucks. I was buying back my name. As I walked out of the courthouse, the sun was blinding. I put on my sunglasses. I felt lighter than I had in years. The burden of betrayal was gone. The weight of their expectations was gone. Preston, Tiffany, and Greg were waiting for me on the courthouse steps. They looked like beggars. The entitlement had been replaced by a terrified realization of their new reality. Dad Preston started stepping forward. His voice was trembling. "Dad, listen. We can fix this. I can help you run it. I learned a lot these past few weeks. We can be a team again." Harrison Tiffany cried, tears streaming down her face. "Please, I have nowhere to go. They took my condo. Can I just stay in the guest house? I won't make a sound. I promise." I stopped. I looked at them one last time. I looked at the son who had mocked my hands. I looked at the daughter who had sold my memories. I looked at the son-in-law who had tried to bury me. I took a deep breath. The air smelled of freedom. I didn't say a word. I didn't yell. I didn't lecture them. I simply put my headphones on. I pressed play on my old Walkman. The sound of Johnny Cash filled my ears. I walked past them as if they were invisible. I walked down the steps, past the weeping, past the begging, and climbed into my old Ford pickup truck. I started the engine. It roared to life, drowning out their voices. I drove straight to the logistics park. The fence was already coming down. The drivers were waiting. As I pulled up to the gate, 500 horns blasted in unison. It was a deafening, glorious salute. The employees were lined up, cheering, clapping, some of them crying. Big Mike was there. Sarah was there. I got out of the truck. I walked through the crowd, shaking hands, patting backs. I walked into the lobby. I walked past the security desk where Bronson used to stand. I walked into the elevator and pressed the button for the top floor. When I entered my office, it was empty. The glass desk was gone, repossessed by the leasing company. My old mahogany desk was back, retrieved from storage by the staff. I sat down in my chair. I looked out the window at the yard below. The trucks were moving again. The world was turning. I was 70 years old. I had lost my wife. I had lost my family. But as I watched the first truck roll out of the gate, heading for the highway, I realized I hadn't lost the most important thing. I hadn't lost myself. And for the first time in a long time, I was ready to drive. Life has a funny way of teaching us that blood is not always thicker than water. Sometimes the people who share your DNA are the ones holding the knife to your back. I learned that you cannot buy respect, and you certainly cannot inherit character. My stepchildren thought wealth was a right, not a reward for hard work. They mistook my kindness for weakness and my silence for stupidity. But the greatest lesson I learned is that it is never too late to take back your power. You are never too old to fight for your dignity. If you are surrounded by people who only value you for what you can give them, cut the cord. It might be painful, but it is the only way to survive. Thank you for listening to my story. If this resonated with you, if you have ever felt undervalued or betrayed by those closest to you, please hit that like button and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories of justice and resilience. Let me know in the comments which city you are watching from. I read every single one. Stay strong and remember, the best revenge is living well. See you in the next story.